Picture this. You're a young bride named Margot, barely 15 years old, standing in the doorway of a stone cottage in 1347 AD. Your new husband, Henrik, approaches your marriage bed. The rushes beneath your bare feet crackle with each nervous step. Candlelight flickers across his weathered face. He's nearly twice your age, chosen by your father for his 3 pigs and half an acre of barley. Your hands tremble as you clutch the rough woolen shift your mother made for this very night, the same one she wore, and her mother before her. Through the thin walls, you can hear his friends outside, drunk on ale, shouting crude encouragements, and banging pots with wooden spoons. They won't leave until they hear proof of consummation. Your breath comes in quick gasps as Henrik's callous fingers reach for the leather cord at your throat. You wonder if your mother's whispered warnings about wifely duties could ever prepare you for what's about to happen in this cramped, smoky room that smells of wet wool and unwashed bodies. This is not a love story. This is the reality of medieval intimacy, a world where sexual practices were shaped by superstition, religious fear, and survival instincts that would seem utterly strange to our modern views on romance and desire. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about history's hidden truths, consider liking this video and subscribing for more content. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The medieval bedroom was a battlefield where bodies were political territories, where the church's rules clashed with pagan traditions, and where the most intimate parts of life were governed by strange and harsh regulations that would make a modern person uncomfortable. These weren't just personal choices. They involved eternal salvation, family, honor, and literally life and death. Let me take you back to Margot's world, where the idea of marital rape didn't exist because wives were seen as property, where menstrual blood was thought to be so dangerous it could kill crops, and where the wrong sexual position could damn your soul to hell forever. In medieval Europe, the marriage bed was never truly private. The community, the church, and old superstitions all had a stake in what happened between husband and wife. When Margot married Henrik in the autumn of 1347 AD, their union wasn't celebrated with champagne and dancing. It was a business transaction, sealed with bodily fluids, witnessed by neighbors who had every right to demand proof of consummation. The wedding night ritual began long before the couple touched. First came the bedding ceremony, where the wedding guests would literally drag the bride and groom to their chamber, undress them while singing raunchy songs, and then stand outside the door listening for the sounds that would confirm the marriage was legally binding. Henrik's friends wouldn't leave until they heard Margot's cries of pain, proof that her hymen had been broken and the marriage was consummated. But here's where medieval intimacy gets truly strange. The church taught that even married couples could commit mortal sins in their own beds. St. Jerome, writing in the 4th century AD, declared that a man who loves his wife too passionately is an adulterer. The church fathers believed excessive pleasure, even in marriage, was a corruption of the soul. This wasn't just theory. It influenced every part of medieval sexual practice. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian, laid out rules for married couples in his Summa Theologica around 1265 AD. Sexual intercourse was only acceptable on certain days of the week, during specific seasons, and in one position: man on top, woman underneath, face to face. Any deviation was deemed unnatural and therefore sinful. Oral sex was completely forbidden, as was sex during menstruation, pregnancy, or while breastfeeding. The church calculated that if all these rules were followed, married couples could have sex only about 50 days each year. Margot would have learned these rules from her mother, who learned them from the village priest during confession. The weight of eternal damnation hung over every intimate moment. When Henrik reached for her on a forbidden Wednesday during Lent, she faced a crushing choice. Should she submit to her husband's will and risk her soul, or refuse and face his anger in a world where domestic violence was not only legal but expected? The medieval view of female sexuality was based on misunderstandings that persisted for centuries. Medical texts from the period, influenced by ancient Greek and Roman sources, taught that women were essentially defective men. Their sexual organs were just inverted versions of male genitalia. The vagina was seen as an inside-out penis, and the ovaries were considered internal testicles. This wasn't mere ignorance. It was accepted medical knowledge taught in universities. across Europe. These beliefs had lasting impacts on how medieval people understood female desire and pleasure. The physician Constantine the African, writing in the 11th century AD, claimed that women experienced sexual pleasure differently than men. They needed prolonged stimulation and multiple climaxes to conceive. This led to the strange beliefs surrounding female sexuality that would echo through the ages. The belief that a woman could not get pregnant from rape, as she needed to experience pleasure for conception to occur. Medieval courts often treated a woman's pregnancy after an assault as evidence that she had enjoyed it and was thus partially to blame. Margot's mother might have warned her about the wandering womb, a condition medieval doctors claimed could lead to hysteria, madness, and even death. They believed that the uterus could move around inside a woman's body, traveling upward, to strangle her heart, or downward, to escape through her vagina. Treatments involved fumigating the vagina with pleasant scents to coax the womb back into place, or using unpleasant smells to drive it downward. The medieval period inherited a complex set of fertility beliefs from pagan traditions that the church never fully wiped out. Village-wise women, often labeled as witches, later on, kept hidden knowledge of herbs, rituals, and practices aimed at encouraging conception, preventing pregnancy, or ensuring the birth of sons. In the woods near Margot's village, women would gather specific plants under the full moon. Pennyroyal and tansy were made into teas thought to prevent pregnancy. The difference between effective contraception and death was dangerously narrow. Mandrake root, shaped like a human figure, was believed to boost fertility when worn as an amulet against the skin. Real mandrake was so valuable that fake versions made from carved brine were common in medieval markets. The church officially condemned these practices as witchcraft, but even devout Christians found it hard to let them go completely. The line between folk medicine and magic was almost impossible to define. A woman might pray to St. Margaret for a safe delivery while burying a piece of afterbirth under her threshold to promote future fertility. She might wear a crucifix to church while hiding a piece of amber between her breasts to prevent miscarriage. Medieval contraception was a dangerous mix of superstition, poison, and desperation. Women learned to jump backwards 7 times after having sex to avoid conception, or to drink wine mixed with ground bees. Even more hazardous were potions made from mercury, lead, and other toxic substances that frequently harmed the woman along with any potential pregnancy. The stakes for unwanted pregnancies were high. In a time without reliable birth control, women lived under the constant fear of dying in childbirth. Maternal mortality rates were alarming. 1 in 3 women perished during or shortly after delivery. For unmarried women, pregnancy often led to social ruin, exile, or death. Infanticide was officially condemned, but understood by many as a desperate woman's last option. Marriage arrangements in the medieval era resembled military campaigns, with bodies as the primary battlefield. When Margot's father arranged her marriage to Henrik, her virginity was literally her dowry, more precious than gold or livestock. The hymen became a measure of honor, exchanged between families as proof of their daughter's purity and their own good name. The wedding night was not just about consummation. It was a public verification of the bride's virginity. Bloodied sheets would be displayed to the gathered crowd as proof that the marriage was valid. If no blood was found, the bride could be sent back to her family in disgrace or even killed for deceit. The pressure on young brides was immense. Some secretly pricked their fingers or hid chicken blood to provide the evidence their new families demanded. However, medieval medical understanding of virginity was flawed. They thought the hymen was a solid membrane that completely blocked the vaginal opening, rather than the partial, flexible tissue it truly is. They believed that its absence was undeniable proof of sexual activity, when in reality, it could be torn by horseback riding, lifting heavy objects, or just natural variations in anatomy. The church's doctrine of consummation led to its own strange practices. A marriage was not seen as legally binding until sexual intercourse had occurred, which meant proving or disproving consummation became a legal matter. Church courts would examine both husband and wife, questioning them separately about intimate details of their wedding night. They would inspect the woman's body for signs of penetration and ask neighbors what they had overheard through the walls. Medieval sexual positions were heavily regulated by church doctrine, but the actual situation was more complicated. The missionary position was not only preferred, it was the only one that wouldn't condemn one's soul to hell. The church taught that any position with the woman on top was unnatural, as it challenged the order of male dominance. Rear entry was viewed as beastly, linking human sexuality to animal mating. However, medieval literature suggests a more complex reality. The fabliaux, comic stories popular in medieval France, depicted sexual encounters that would have scandalized the church authorities. These tales, often told by traveling minstrels in taverns and market squares, reveal a hidden world where couples experimented with forbidden behaviors despite the risk of eternal damnation. The French poet Andreas Capellanus, writing around 1180 for AD, described elaborate courtship rituals that included detailed instructions for sexual positions and techniques. His work suggests that among the nobility, there was a complex understanding of sexual pleasure that went far beyond the church's strict teachings. However, these practices were dangerous. Secrets being discovered could lead to excommunication, exile, or death. People in medieval times lived in fear of sexual demons believed to attack humans during vulnerable moments. The succubus and incubus were not just folklore, they were accepted medical and theological truths. Church authorities taught that these demons could take human form to seduce men and women, stealing their life force through sexual acts. The succubus, a female demon that seduced men, was blamed for nocturnal emissions, sexual dreams, and any sexual thoughts outside of marriage. Medieval theologians created elaborate theories about how these demons operated. They believed a demon could first take female form to collect semen from a man, then change into male form to impregnate a woman with the stolen seed. Any child from such a union was thought to be cursed or demonic. The incubus posed an even greater threat to medieval women. These male demons were said to be physically stronger than humans and able to overpower their victims. Women who reported sexual dreams or experiences they couldn't explain were often accused of consorting with demons. The line between victim and witch was dangerously thin. Sleep paralysis, now understood as a neurological phenomenon, was seen as demonic sexual assault. Men and women who woke unable to move, often feeling pressure on their chest, were believed to be under demonic attack. The church prescribed elaborate rituals of exorcism and purification, but many suspected victims were burned as witches instead. The medieval understanding of menstruation was rooted in fear and superstition that lasted for centuries. Menstrual blood was thought to be so poisonous that it could kill crops, spoil wine, and cause men to lose their strength. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, whose works were still studied in medieval universities, claimed that menstrual blood could drive dogs insane and make knives dull. Women during their cycles were seen as dangerous pollutants who needed to be isolated from normal society. They could not enter churches, prepare food, or touch sacred objects. In many villages, menstruating women were required to live in special huts outside the community until their bleeding stopped. The church taught that menstruation was God's punishment for Eve's original sin, making each monthly cycle a reminder of feminine shame. The lack of understanding about menstruation led to strange medical practices. Physicians thought that menstrual blood that wasn't properly expelled from the body would build up and poison the woman from within. They recommended bloodletting, purging, and other risky treatments to balance the female humors. Some doctors suggested sexual intercourse as a cure for menstrual disorders, believing that male seed could neutralize the harmful effects of menstrual blood. Medieval women developed their own secret knowledge on managing their cycles. They used moss, cloth, rags, and sheepskin as basic menstrual protection. They tracked their cycles by lunar phases and created herbal remedies to ease cramps and regulate flow. This knowledge was passed down through generations of women, carefully hidden from male physicians and church authorities who might condemn it as witchcraft. The medieval period saw the rise of complex theories about sexual compatibility based on astrological signs, bodily humors, and physical traits. Medieval physicians believed that sexual pleasure and fertility depended on the right balance of hot and cold, wet and dry humors in both partners. A hot husband might be incompatible with a cold wife, leading to sexual dysfunction and infertility. Physical examination of potential spouses was common among wealthy families. Physicians would examine the bride's body for signs of her sexual temperament. Wide hips indicated fertility, while narrow hips suggested barrenness. The groom's penis size and shape were analyzed for compatibility with his intended bride. These examinations were conducted with the same clinical detachment used for evaluating livestock. The church authorities created their own theories about sexual compatibility based on spiritual rather than physical traits. They taught that couples too closely related by blood or spiritual kinship would be cursed with sexual dysfunction and monstrous children. The complex rules of consanguinity meant that many medieval marriages were annulled when previously unknown family connections were found. Medieval sexuality was closely linked to ideas of honor, shame, and social status. A man's sexual ability was tied to his reputation as a warrior and leader. Impotence was not just a personal failing. It could publicly humiliate a man and ruin his standing in his community. The medieval French developed elaborate euphemisms for sexual dysfunction, creating a language of shame that affected all social interactions. For women, sexual reputation was even more fragile. The smallest hint of impropriety could ruin a woman's marriage prospects and her family's honor. Medieval towns were small communities where everyone knew each other's business. A woman seen talking to a man who wasn't her husband or relative could be labeled as a. The standards for women's behavior were so strict that even married women lived in constant fear of gossip and accusations. The medieval legal system reflected these sexual anxieties in its treatment of rape, adultery, and sexual assault. Rape was defined not as a crime against the woman, but as a crime against the male who owned her father, husband, or lord. The punishment for rape varied drastically based on the social status of both the victim and the perpetrator. A nobleman who raped a peasant woman might pay a small fine, while a peasant who raped a noble woman could face torture and death. Adultery was punished even more harshly, but only for women. A married woman who had sex with any man other than her husband could be killed by her husband without legal consequences. Medieval law specifically granted husbands the right to murder wives and their lovers if caught in the act. Men, however, were generally free to have sex with unmarried women, prostitutes, or their own servants without facing any legal punishment. The medieval period saw the rise of elaborate courtship rituals that would shape European culture for centuries. The tradition of courtly love, popularized in the poetry of the troubadours, created a parallel world where sexual desire was viewed as a spiritual quest. These romantic ideals were mainly a literary fantasy enjoyed by the nobility, but they profoundly influenced how medieval people saw the connection between love and sexuality. The courtly love tradition taught that true love could only exist outside of marriage. A knight's devotion to his lady was supposed to remain forever unfulfilled, existing in constant longing that purified the soul through suffering. This created a strange divide between marital sexuality, which was purely functional, and romantic love, which was purely spiritual. The reality of medieval courtship was much more practical. Among the peasantry, young people might have some say in choosing marriage partners, but economic factors always took priority over personal preference. A village girl might prefer the blacksmith's son, but if the miller offered better terms to her father, she would end up marrying a man she barely knew. Engagement practices included rituals to test the compatibility of potential spouses. In some areas, engaged couples were allowed to sleep together clothed, separated by a wooden board called a bundling board. This practice enabled families to assess whether the couple was physically compatible without risking pregnancy or breaking church rules about premarital sex. The medieval period inherited a complex tradition of sexual magic and fertility rituals from earlier pagan cultures. These practices were driven underground by Christian persecution, but never entirely vanished. Medieval peasants continued to observe ancient fertility rituals, often disguised as Christian celebrations or blended into folk medicine. The celebration of May Day retained strong sexual connotations despite church efforts to suppress it. Young people would spend the night in the forest, ostensibly gathering flowers and branches to decorate the village. In reality, May Day was an opportunity for sexual experimentation and courtship outside the usual restrictions of village life. Many pregnancies were likely the result of May Day encounters, contributing to an increase in February births. Wedding celebrations included various fertility rituals meant to ensure the couple's reproductive success. The bride might be showered with grain or nuts to encourage pregnancy. The marriage bed would be blessed with holy water, but also secretly prepared with herbs and charms believed to boost fertility. These customs reflected a desperate attempt to control reproduction in a world where infant mortality was high and family survival depended on having healthy children. The medieval understanding of conception was a strange mix of Aristotelian philosophy, Christian teachings, and folk beliefs. Medieval doctors thought that both men and women produce seed, which combined during intercourse to create new life. They taught that female orgasm was necessary for conception, leading to the troubling belief that women who became pregnant after rape must have enjoyed the experience. Medieval people created complex theories about how to influence the sex of unborn children. They believed that conceiving during certain phases of the moon would produce male children, while others would lead to females. The stars' positions at the moment of conception were thought to affect not only the child's sex but also its character and future opportunities. The medieval period also saw the development of increasingly refined methods of sexual control and surveillance. The church set up networks of informants who reported on their neighbors' private lives. Confession became a way to gather intimate details about sexual practices, with priests questioning penitents about their most private moments. The rise of the Inquisition in the 13th century brought new forms of sexual persecution. Suspected heretics were tortured into confessing not only their religious beliefs but also their sexual practices. The interrogation manuals used by inquisitors included detailed guidelines, questions about sexual positions, the frequency of intercourse, and the physical sensations experienced during sex. Medieval prisons had specific punishments for sexual crimes. Women found guilty of adultery could be put in cages to small to stand in, receiving only bread and water until they starved. Men convicted of rape might face public castration before being hanged. These harsh punishments aim not just to penalize the guilty, but also to instill fear in the entire community. To enforce sexual compliance, the medieval era produced a wealth of literature on sexual advice and instruction, but most of it was concealed from the average person. Medical texts included detailed accounts of sexual positions and techniques, available only to educated doctors and wealthy patrons. The typical medieval person learned about sex through hushed talks, folk songs, and the hard lessons of trial and error. The church created its own sexual literature but focused more on listing sins than providing helpful advice. Penitential manuals detailed hundreds of sexual practices and their associated punishments. These texts show a curiosity about sexual matters that contradicts the church's official stance on celibacy and purity. Medieval marriage manuals aimed at wealthy patrons offered insights into the sexual lives of the nobility. They provided guidance on everything from wedding night practices to navigating sexual relationships during pregnancy. These texts show a nuanced understanding of sexual pleasure that was hidden from the general public but clearly experienced by those who could afford privacy. The medieval period saw increasingly complex forms of sexual punishment and control. The chastity belt, while likely less common than commonly believed, symbolizes the lengths some individuals went to control female sexuality. These devices were physical restraints and represented the fear surrounding women's sexual autonomy. Medieval brothels existed both legally and illegally at the same time. The church officially condemned prostitution, but secular authorities often licensed and regulated it. Medieval cities had official red light districts where sex workers operated under government oversight. These women had to wear specific clothing, live in designated areas, and undergo regular medical checks. The medieval era produced some of the most unusual sexual customs in European history. The rite of first night, or droner, supposedly allowed feudal lords to have sex with their peasants' brides on their wedding night. Although historians debate whether this practice really took place, its mere suggestion highlights the total sexual vulnerability of medieval peasant women. People believed that sexual activity could affect everything from the weather to the outcome of military campaigns. Kings and nobles consulted astrologers about the best times for sexual relations, thinking that cosmic forces at conception would influence their children's fate. Army leaders might instruct their soldiers to abstain from sex before battles, believing that sexual activity would weaken their fighting spirit. The medieval period developed sophisticated methods of sexual surveillance and control. Local communities created social pressures to regulate sexual behavior. Young people rarely had private time together, and married couples were expected to behave according to community standards. The medieval view of sexual pleasure was heavily shaped by religious beliefs about the soul and body. The church taught that sexual pleasure was a trap set by the devil to distract people from spiritual reflection. Even in marriage, excessive enjoyment of sexual intercourse was seen as sinful and potentially damning. Medieval people devised complex strategies to manage sexual desire and control their bodies. Fasting, cold baths, and self-discipline were used to curb sexual urges. Young people were advised to avoid situations that might lead to sexual excitement, including certain foods, music, and entertainment. The medieval period also saw a rich underground culture of sexual rebellion. Despite the church's control efforts, people found ways to express their desires and seek pleasure. This hidden world of sexual defiance existed alongside the official culture of repression. Medieval sexuality was influenced by practical matters that modern individuals rarely think about. The lack of privacy in medieval homes meant that sexual activity often occurred in shared spaces with children, servants, and other family members. The sounds and smells of sex were a part of daily life in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. The medieval era also saw increasingly intricate relationships between sexuality and social class. The sexual privileges of the nobility reflected their broader control over society. Lords and ladies had access to private rooms, fancy foods, and leisure that allowed them to explore sexual pleasure in ways that peasants could not. Ultimately, medieval marriage was about survival rather than love or sexual fulfillment. In a world where life expectancy was short and infant mortality was high, the primary purpose of marriage was to produce children who could carry on the family name and work the land. Sexual pleasure was a secondary consideration at best, and often seen as a dangerous distraction from more important concerns. The medieval period produced some of the most restrictive sexual customs in European history, but it also saw the development of sophisticated forms of sexual resistance and rebellion. Medieval people found ways to pursue pleasure and express their desires despite the overwhelming social pressure to conform to religious and social expectations. As we return to Margot in her stone cottage, Henrik's hands still reaching for her in the flickering candlelight, we can understand her terror, not just as personal fear, but as the weight of an entire culture's sexual anxieties pressed down upon her young shoulders. She carries the burden of religious doctrine, family honor, community surveillance, and her own desperate desire for survival in a world that offers her no protection. The medieval period reminds us that human sexuality has always been shaped by power, fear, and social control. The bizarre practices and beliefs of medieval people seem alien to us now, but they emerged from the same fundamental human needs and desires that drive sexual behavior in every era. Understanding medieval sexuality helps us recognize how our own sexual culture reflects the power structures and social anxieties of our time. Medieval intimacy was never truly intimate. It was always public, always political, always dangerous. The bedroom was a battlefield where souls were won and lost, where family honor was defended or destroyed, where the most private moments of human life were governed by rules that seemed designed to eliminate pleasure and maximize suffering. The medieval period produced some of the most restrictive sexual customs in European history, but it also reveals the incredible resilience of human sexual desire. Despite centuries of religious persecution, social control, and legal punishment, medieval people found ways to pursue love, pleasure, and intimate connection. Their stories remind us that sexuality is one of the most fundamental aspects of human experience, too powerful to be completely controlled by any system of authority. The strange and often disturbing sexual practices of medieval Europe were not simply the result of ignorance or superstition. They emerged from a complex interaction of religious doctrine, social structure, economic necessity, and genuine human need. Understanding these practices helps us appreciate both how far we have come and how many of the same underlying tensions continue to shape human sexuality today. In the end, the medieval period teaches us that sexuality is always political, always dangerous, and always essential to human experience. The bizarre, intimate practices of medieval people were their attempts to navigate these eternal tensions between desire and control, pleasure and danger, love and survival. Their struggles remind us that the quest for sexual freedom and authentic intimacy is not a modern invention, but an ancient human aspiration that transcends any particular historical moment. The candle light still flickers across Henrik's weathered face as he reaches for young Margot. But now we understand that this moment contains the entire weight of medieval sexual culture. The fear, the superstition, the desperate hope for survival, and the eternal human longing for connection despite impossible odds. In her trembling hands and his callous fingers, we see not just two people, but the collision of an entire civilization's sexual anxieties and desires played out in the most intimate space imaginable, yet never truly private, never truly safe, never truly